So I'd like to present you a little piece of research where I think it becomes quite visible that there's a lot of potential in virtual reality for healthcare. It's basic psychology, so we're not working with patients yet, but I think we can see where things are heading to. So as I said, I work in the field of clinical psychology at the University of Fribourg, and I'll explain in a minute what these images mean. Because first, I would like to mention that in clinical psychology, of course, the ultimate goal is always to help patients. And when we run a study with virtual bodies where people have an illusion where they're in another body, we always have in the back of our minds that at some point we would like to use this to really help people who are suffering from something. And it is relevant for clinical psychology because there are body image disturbances in some psychiatric conditions. If you think about your own body, it's very weird because usually you don't think about it a lot. Your brain just automatically tracks for you how large you are, if you will fit through the door, these kind of things. But for some patients, this is not the case, and the representation of their body, which is constructed by the brain, actually differs from the physical body. As is depicted in this nice image, where a more corpulent woman may think of herself as thinner than she actually is, or a quite thin woman, or man in that case, could think of her or himself as somebody who's more corpulent. In some of these conditions, for instance in Anorexia Nervosa, it's the case that people are very thin and they seem not to really realize it, but they still believe they're too corpulent. It's one of the deadliest psychiatric diseases because of this reason. They just become thinner and thinner and keep their drive for thinness, still believing they're too corpulent. And it's not only tragic, it's also very bizarre because these people are normal in their intelligence. Sometimes they're above average in intelligence. And yet they may be unable to really find out what their real physical body looks like. The condition is also very mysterious because after decades of research, we still don't really know what is disturbed in these patients. Is it their thoughts, the way they think about it? Is it their attitudes? Is it something more implicit, maybe just the feeling of having a body? And that's really very difficult to find out because as soon as you ask them, you're on an explicit level. So you have to find ways to really differentiate what kind of aspects of bodily experience can even be disturbed. There are many more open questions. For instance, we still don't really know if the body image disturbance is something that causes other symptoms or if it's just co-varying with other symptoms. It's still not really understood if it's best described as a psychological phenomenon or maybe even a neurological phenomenon. But at this point, we would just like to find out more about the phenomenon itself. And I think that the short study that I will present shows quite clearly that virtual reality has the capability to clarify some of these open questions in ways that usually we couldn't be clarifying. So if we now look at this image, that's the virtual body illusion that we were implementing for the study. So the woman on the left is represented as this virtual woman. And in this case, everything works quite fine. So she can touch her hips using these controllers and observe congruent touch on the virtual body. But if we want to use this technology to find out more about touch, we could try and experimentally vary this touch congruency. So what we did here, in the next step, we made the virtual body more corpulent, which resulted in a loss of touch congruency. So as you can see here, the controllers start to intrude the hips. And if this person is immersed in this situation, then touch as a congruent sense is lost. If we adopt the same kind of illusion, but use a different algorithm to apply this distortion, then we can have a more corpulent body, but still have touch congruent. So the whole algorithm is online on my GitHub page in case anybody would like to look more deeply into that. But essentially what we have is a very direct comparison of two situations where somebody is immersed in a virtual situation with a more corpulent body, but in one case, touch is more or less diminished, whereas in the other case, we still have congruent touch. So what we did, we just had 40 participants altogether, 20 for each condition, being involved in this situation. And we tried to find out now, what does this do to the people if they can experience this virtual body and have or do not have the sensation of congruent touch? Does that alter anything in the way they process their body? And we investigated this question on two different levels. First of all, the body image, which is like the explicit body representation, where you just ask people, how do you feel about your body? Do you feel like the body in the mirror is your body, the virtual body? Do you feel like you're in control of the body? And then on another level, we looked at implicit changes, so that's sometimes referred to as the body schema. And in this case, we just had people walk around in the laboratory. This is a top-down view, where people would walk around these tables, and we would measure the safety distances which they kept to obstacles, believing that if you're more corpulent, or if you believe that you're more corpulent, you would have larger safety distances to these obstacles. Now, in the results, we can see that on the explicit level, there was no real difference on any of those measures between the conditions. So it seems that there's no difference if you have congruent or not congruent touch on any of those dimensions of how you think explicitly about your own body. At the same time, when we look at how they changed the safety distances from a first round where they were not immersed in virtual reality to 3 consecutive rounds in virtual reality, then we can see that if they experienced congruent touch, then compared to the participants who did not experience congruent touch, they would adapt their behavior as though they were getting more corpulent. So we can see that on an implicit level, this did actually change something in the participants, whereas on the explicit level, we found nothing. So I think that to sum up, it seems quite interesting to use virtual reality for these kind of questions because we can create situations which are impossible in reality. We had people experience a more corpulent body which they could congruently touch, which is something that you just cannot do in reality. I think that we saw here that the sense of touch has a very interesting influence on the way we perceive our bodies, in this case not on an explicit level, but on an implicit level, which is something that we could not have found out in that way if we didn't use virtual reality. And I think that it shows that altering implicit levels of how you perceive your body actually opens up a very interesting window for changing the body schema in the normal population, which is interesting enough, but of course also in psychiatric conditions, so people who really need to change their body schema. That's something that is barely done. We haven't done it, and I don't know of any other study that's thoroughly tried this. So I would say that it's an understudied field yet, and I think it's very promising and a very interesting research field for the years to come. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.